The most recent edition of the Trial of Lucy Letby podcast, featuring Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham for the Daily Mail, featured an interview with uncalled defence witness from the Lucy Letby case, Dr. Mike Hall. In this video, I'm going to begin analysing that podcast and its contents, starting with the first half of the production. Before I get into going through the transcript itself, I want to mention that there are 6 themes that are particularly evident to me during this podcast. And when I say 6 themes, this is emanating from Hull and Cheetham. I could have mentioned these at the end, but I think it would be illustrative to mention them before we begin so that you can look out for them as we go through the transcript. So the first one we see is just absolute blind faith in the system. That's not unusual. You get a lot of system-serving people. There are a surprisingly large amount of system-serving people in the media. But I think that you won't doubt by the end of this podcast that my description of them in this regard is accurate. The second one is very much linked to the first theme, which is putting the court and jury on a pedestal. You'll see that as we go over the 2 parts of this podcast, that Caroline and Liz are particularly obsessed with legal tactics. The third thing, again, these first three are all very much linked, are arguments of procedure and what is sometimes called jurisprudence. So these are just essentially legal arguments. I'll come back to this in a second. The fourth thing is that they will deliberately misrepresent something that's been said, also referred to as smear tactics. A fifth theme is that they will claim that there were experts in court, so it's just one group of experts against another group of experts, which, as we know, is highly disingenuous given the disparity between the two. And then the sixth is another classic, particularly of tabloidy journalists, the appeal to emotion, so trying to influence your opinion by influencing your emotions. Now, I just want to return briefly to the court arguments before we begin looking at the transcript. So I'll probably summarise this at the end of this part as well. But the key thing really is that what happens in the courtroom really isn't that important to me. What is important to me is what happened in actual reality. So I don't put the court system on a pedestal. I don't put the policies and procedure of the court system on a pedestal. The sole reason the court system exists in my world is so that it can identify and investigate the truth, so that they can establish what the truth is in a particular situation through a process of investigation. If the court system doesn't exist for that reason, then why does it exist apart from to ensure that lawyers make money? What other possible reason could there be? That a kind of offshoot of the search for truth is the assurance that people that are guilty are punished and people that are not guilty are not punished. Those are surely the 2 primary, I would say, sole purposes of the court system, or the Crown Court system, the criminal courts. It is to establish the truth around a situation where a crime may have been committed, and then to ensure that the person who has committed this hypothetical crime is punished, or if they haven't committed the crime, they are not punished. So what you see in this podcast, and typically those that wish to pretend that Lucy Letby is guilty will rely on these arguments quite a lot. As you'll see these kind of arguments of process, procedure, legal tactics, why weren't witnesses called, procedural things, jurisprudence. All of that is completely meaningless as far as I'm concerned, because none of that has any impact on what happened in the actual reality. In the actual reality, we all know that there were no crimes at this hospital, let alone did Lucy Letby commit any crimes. What we've seen very clearly is a neonatal unit that is not running well for numerous reasons, with problems with staffing, procedures on the unit, sanitary conditions, and then they're dealing with babies that they're not qualified to deal with, or that they're not in an adequate position to deal with. And so therefore these infants have passed away, sometimes due to medical errors, sometimes they could have been saved, sometimes possibly even on a good unit they would have passed away. It's very hard to say, of course, that's difficult to say definitively. The Now, that is what I care about, and that is what I consider to be justice. Justice can also be used, or it can also be viewed as a kind of legal process and a kind of outcome of legal process, but that's not what I consider justice to be, and that's not what 99% of people consider justice to be. Most people consider justice to be what is right and proper, and that is what the legal system should ultimately deliver. The purpose of the legal system is not to defend its own policies, procedures, and this kind of jurisprudent architecture that exists. The purpose of the legal system, as I say, is to ensure that people that have committed crimes are punished and people that haven't committed crimes are not punished. So what we see throughout this podcast is two people in Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham who are in absolute thrall to the legal system, and I just don't share that at all. I respect people that do the jobs to the best of their ability in the legal system and do it ethically and morally, but ultimately I treat them the same way as anyone else. I don't look up to them, I don't look down on them. I just view them as equal to me, and I don't see any particular reason to put them on a pedestal. I don't see any reason to put the court on a pedestal. The court's just staffed and manned by human beings. Human beings can make mistakes, and we know they often do make mistakes, and we know they often make mistakes in the legal system. So I think a lot of arguments for me that are made in this podcast are essentially redundant. All I care about is, were there any murders at this hospital? All of the evidence points to no, so therefore Lucy Letby should be released as soon as possible. And all these arguments that you're going to see about legal tactics and whether or not this should have happened or whether or not that should have happened and why this person wasn't called and why this person wasn't called and what about this thing that was said in court, what about this procedural issue, and to me it's just a load of waffle and a load of nonsense as far as I'm concerned, because it's imbuing the court with a significance that it doesn't deserve. The court ultimately is there to find out the truth. It's as simple as that. And what happened in actual reality is what matters. It doesn't matter what happened in the courtroom. The courtroom is just a theatre, as is actually conceded during this podcast. So I don't care about the theatrical arguments or procedural aspects of what we call justice. I care about the actual human justice, which is what, as I say, 99% of the population actually care about. The most recent... So the first section is uneventful, but I'll go through it anyway. So Caroline Cheetham says, "Welcome to the Trial Podcast. I'm Caroline Cheetham." And I'm Liz Hull. And then back to Caroline Cheetham. "So a special episode for you today on the ongoing conversations about Lucy Letby and her convictions. And that's because you and I, Liz, have finally been able to sit down for really a proper in-depth conversation with the man who is her key defence expert witness and also the man who was never called to give evidence at her trial." So I think Caroline and Liz in this opening section, they might identify the fact that they have very strongly come down on the side of guilt. And they pretty much did that from day one, and they certainly did that in their podcast series. And really, there is very little representation in that podcast series of arguments that Lucy Letby is not guilty, or even that it's an unsafe conviction. They were absolutely hook, line and sinker, taken in by the prosecution case, as a lot of people were. We don't hear any mention of that. We don't hear a lot of mention of that during this particular podcast. So then Liz Hull says, "Yes, so that of course is Dr. Mike Hall, Caroline. Now, we know provided he provided reports on the babies at the centre of the case for Ben Myers, who of course represented Lucy Letby at the original hearings. Now, Dr. Hall also sat through every day of her trial observing from the courtroom next door." And Caroline Cheetham says, "Yeah, but he was never called to give evidence in front of the jury, and much of the ongoing debate has been about this decision. Was that decision not to call Dr. Hall some kind of fundamental failure on the part of Ben Myers, and could it actually amount to a possible miscarriage of justice, as some of the critics of her convictions are now saying?" So this is a classic example of, like straw man tactics, misrepresenting the argument. No one is saying that not calling a defence witness represents a miscarriage of justice, obviously. What we're saying is that if you have one side with prosecution witnesses and if you have the other side with no witnesses, then it results in a very unfair trial. That's nothing to do with whether or not it's a miscarriage of justice. The only thing that matters as to whether it's a miscarriage of justice is whether, in actual reality, Lucy Letby is guilty of what she's been accused of doing. Liz and Caroline are obsessed with the court system. As I say, I don't care about the court system. All I care about is, were there any crimes? Which is all, as I say, 99% of people care about. So we're not saying it's a miscarriage of justice because Dr. Hull wasn't called. We're saying it's a miscarriage of justice because there were no crimes. So then Liz Hull says, yeah, or was it a tactical legal decision? So already they're talking about their tactical legal decisions because they're obsessed with the court. Partly possibly because they're court reporters, but they could hardly be less in thrall to the court and the judge and the barristers and the procedure and the process. Like they're in love with it, honestly. Because it's worth pointing out here as well that the ultimate decision whether or not to call him was Lucy Letby's. Ben Meyer's job is to advise her to lay out what Dr. Hull was expected to say on the witness stand and to explain how the prosecution might respond to that evidence and cross-examine him, but ultimately the final decision rested with her. Now, I've already addressed this in previous videos, but I will address it once again. So the idea that Lucy Letby is going to run her own defence strategy is ridiculous. Obviously, she's given a court-appointed barrister, and she will just follow the advice of her barrister, as Liz Hull would if she was in this situation. It could easily happen that Liz Hull would be wrongly convicted of something. Liz Hull would now be sitting in prison, completely innocent, feeling very sorry for herself. And I would think, under those circumstances, she would be given a court-appointed barrister. Now, I'd be very surprised if Liz Hull, even though she's been in court and she thinks she knows a bit about the legal system, I'd be fairly surprised if she then started running her own defence strategy. I think what you would see is that the barrister would tell her what to do and she would just rubber stamp it, which is what any sensible person would do in these circumstances. And Lucy's no different. Lucy's clearly an intelligent person, and the idea that she somehow crafted her own defence strategy from behind bars and overruled her barrister, absolute nonsense. It's just an absolute asinine argument, frankly. So then we go on to Cheetham, who says, yeah, so what's coming is a really fascinating discussion from someone at the centre of this case who has rarely spoken in such depth before. And what he told us is, in his view, the legal system is effectively a bit of a game where barristers score points off each other, which I think is undeniable. I don't see how anyone could possibly deny that. I mean, Nick Johnson absolutely treated this like a game, and a game that he was out to win. And we saw that in the way the prosecution presented the evidence. A lot of fabrication, a lot of supposition, a lot of arguments that really have no merit, a lot of things ignored that were in fact exonerating, etc., etc. And in this case, the Lucy Letby case, he feels the decision taken by Ben Myers, or as you point out, Liz, Lucy Letby, not to call him to give evidence was indeed a tactical legal decision, but not necessarily a just one. So again, it's this obsession with legal tactics. It doesn't matter about legal tactics. It doesn't matter why. It doesn't matter why Mike Hall wasn't in the court case. I mean, to some degree, it's interesting. All that really matters is it wasn't a fair trial because the jury didn't hear all manner of important information. On top of that, they heard a lot of information that's either misleading or inaccurate. And then, as I say, it was not a weighted process. It was a very uneven playing field. That is what actually matters, not the legal tactics or the processes of the court or, why Michael wasn't called. The fact is, there were no defence witnesses. Now, Michael doesn't believe Lucy Letby is guilty. That would be the only circumstances in which it really mattered. If Michael said, well, actually, I couldn't defend her, I couldn't say anything in her defence because I believed her to be guilty, that would be significant. That would be very significant. And if the evidence pointed in that direction and the real-world events pointed in that direction, then it would be completely different. That's nothing to do with it. It's because of the failures. The reason they weren't called was because of the failures of the court system. It's as simple as that, because they wouldn't stand in court. Firstly, as we'll see, it's because they weren't allowed. The case wasn't allowed to be presented the way that the defence wanted, and that defence actually would have called Michael if they could have presented the way they wanted to. And then secondly, it's just an overall failing of the procedural way that courts work in this country. But let's get into the interview now. Dr. Michael, hello, good afternoon. My name's Michael. I am currently a visiting professor in neonatal medicine. For most of my career, I was a consultant initially in paediatrics, and for the second half of my career, specifically in neonatal medicine. Cheetham, we should just say your role in terms of the case that we're talking about today. So Lucy Letby, you were initially instructed by Ben Myers, her defence barrister, to be part of the expert witness team. Hull, I was initially approached and asked if I would provide reports on 17 babies who formed the basis for the trial, and so the first 6 months or so was involved in compiling reports on the babies. When I had done that, I was then asked if I would be willing to join the team because, of course, they didn't know a lot about neonatal medicine or how it works, and they, I think, felt a need to have someone who could help them with that. Hull, and then you joined the defence team because I think the barristers would be the first to admit they probably became experts but weren't experts at the beginning in, some quite complex neonatal medicine. So I just want to quibble slightly on that point. The barristers are not experts now in neonatal medicine. I know as much about this case as I would suggest anyone in the world, and I don't claim to be an expert on neonatal medicine. That would be preposterous. Obviously, I interviewed Professor Colin Morley recently. He's an expert in neonatal medicine. I've learnt about this case, and I've learnt enough to ask him questions. I am not an expert, and nor are the barristers. And as I understand it, Liz Hall continues, there was obviously you preparing reports. And then, like the prosecution, did you suggest, oh, maybe we need an expert in this, and maybe we need an expert in radiology, and maybe we need an expert in insulin? How did that work? Can I just start, this is my call, can I just start by saying there's something called litigation privilege, which means as far as I'm aware, I still am not free to talk about what went on between me and the legal team. So any conversations we had, anything I learned really as a result of being part of the defence team, is not something I am at liberty to discuss as I understand it. What I can discuss, I think, is anything that was discussed in the trial that appears in the transcripts. So Cheetham says, yeah, okay, obviously you were the main expert witness. You provided those reports, but there were other expert witnesses as well. That's fair to say as well that Ben Myers asked to be involved. And Mike Hall says, yes, that's correct. So Liz Hall then says, so obviously the really key question, Dr. Hall, that people are asking time and again, and we've had this over and over on our podcast, is the fact that you were not called to give evidence, but you sat there through the whole of the trial, listened to all the evidence from the doctors at the counters, from Dr. Dewi Evans, Sandy Bohin, Owen Arthurs, all the prosecution's expert witnesses. And obviously you've been quite vocal about that, saying, I don't know why I wasn't called, but I'm sure you have an idea of why you weren't called. Are you willing to talk to us about that at all, why you think you weren't called? So I just want to point out there briefly that Liz Hull is trying to talk about the expert witnesses as if there were loads of them and they were all really significant in the case. I've been over this again several times previously, but Dr. Sandy Bowen just rubber-stamped Dr. Evans' opinions. Professor Owen Arthurs provided no support for Dr. Dewi Evans in court. All he said was there was some air, which we know. We don't dispute that. The question is how the air got there and whether it was significant in the collapse of the infants, which experts say it was not, and there's no evidence for this. The other experts, none of which is named, really offered, the only one that really offered significant, I guess, is Hindmarsh and Marna Reeders. Now, I'm going to deal with Marna Reeders in the future. Obviously, we've dealt with the insulin cases in Hindmarsh, but there was very little support for Dr. Evans from the expert witnesses. Dr. Evans is 95% of this prosecution case. Without Dr. Evans, there is no prosecution case. And as I say, Dr. Bohin performed this peer review in which he just handed over reports to her and then she just approved them, essentially. And I'm sure she would deny that, but the idea that you hand over the reports, hand over the conclusions, and then get her to look at it and say, oh, these okay, oh yeah, actually I agree with everything, is ridiculous. But let's move on. Dr. Mike Hall. Well, I can speculate as anybody else. And interestingly, I'm sure you did see in the Times a couple of weeks or so ago, a retired High Court judge gave his view that I demonstrated why I was not called in the Panorama documentary, because according to him, I gave signals that what I said might have been supported the prosecution. I should just say that was a terrible article by another person who is just in love with the legal system, but let's not dwell on that too much. And if it was supportive of the prosecution in one case which led to conviction, then I think that meant the principle of that support could apply to other cases. So it could have a kind of domino effect, I suppose. However, just out of interest, on day 3 of the proceedings, this is before the jury was called, there were arguments going on, and one of the arguments that was being put forward on day 3 was that each case, Mr. Myers was making this case, each case should be held one by one each as a separate entity. I think he used the phrase back to back. So I've referenced this previously, and Liz Hull is going to explain this to some degree. So essentially, just to explain to everyone, because I remember that quite clearly, that legal argument, what they wanted to do was the prosecution case for, say, baby A, the prosecution expert witness of baby A, the defence expert witness of baby A, then move on to baby B, baby C. So do it sequentially, Liz, in other words. But the judge rejected that, essentially. And then Dr. Michael Hull says, as I say, I'm not a legal expert, but as I understood it, I think part of the rationale for rejecting was people like Professor Arthurs, for instance, could only come kind of 2 or 3 times during the course of the trial, and so it wouldn't have been practical for him to come 17 times. So, this is quite extraordinary, is it not? So the judge has just said, right, this we could do child A for the prosecution, then child B for the defence, and we could go through each infant sequentially and treat them as individual incidents, which would be a lot fairer for Lucy and a lot fairer for the process, and Dr. Mike Hall would have been called, and she would have had defence witnesses. But because Professor Arthurs couldn't be bothered to turn up, they just decided, we'll just make it really unfair instead. Maybe Professor Arthurs should have got his arse into gear and turned up 17 times. Or if they can't get an expert who can't turn up, maybe they should have found a different expert. The consequences for Professor Arthurs having to turn up 17 times, I would suggest, are smaller than the consequences for Lucy Letby being found guilty. So they either should have found another expert, or they said, look, Professor Arthurs, if you want to be in the court case, you've got to turn up 17 times. If you can't turn up 17 times, you can't have your money, all right? That's my opinion. I mean, I find it unbelievable. Like, look at the amount of... I understand is he still employed? I think he probably is. I understand he may have other responsibilities, but he has said he will be an expert witness in this court case. So that means he should be there all the time. Look at the amount of effort that I'm putting into this for very minimal remuneration compared to Professor Arthurs. He should be in that... If they needed him 170 times, he should have been in that court 170 times. And if you can't do that, don't take your fee. Don't say you can do it and don't turn up. Because it was turned into an incredibly one-sided process where the jury was just battered over the head, and as it turned out, Lucy couldn't call the defence experts. So I'm sure, in this argument that Liz Hall made earlier on, that, don't forget, Lucy's running her entire defence strategy, I'm sure that Ben Myers has said to her, look, we can't call Professor Hall onto the stand. There's a strategic reason for this. I would call him, if we were doing it baby A, then baby B, then baby C sequentially, but unfortunately, the judge has overruled that, so I don't think it's the right thing for us to do. I hardly think Lucy heard, she heard the judge's decision and she said, right, Ben, right, get in here now. That's just not going to happen. It's an absolute joke. When people say that, whether they're pro-guilty people or so-called journalists, it's just an absurd argument, asinine, utterly stupid, frankly. Anyone who believes that has any legitimacy is an idiot. Cheetham, the whole premise is that these are not separate. These are linked. And I think that was one of the arguments they made as well as a practical one, which I accept would have been a problem, but not insurmountable, you might think. Right, so that sentence doesn't mean anything, Caroline. I don't even know what you meant by that. So let's try and break it down into its constituent parts. The whole premise is that these are not separate. So that's actually a critical point. The first thing to say to that is that if all of these cases had been tried as individual cases, they would have been unbelievably weak. Because you would have been saying, right, we think Lucy Letby did this. What's your evidence? Well, it's just this rash and discoloration, although I made my decision before this rash and discoloration. Has Lucy Letby been seen doing anything wrong? No. Can we say she's definitely at the scene? No. What about this swipe card evidence? Well, that's back to front and upside down. Okay, the court didn't actually hear about that. I just don't... I mean, if it was just one... Imagine if it was just baby A, or imagine if it was just baby C on its own as a solitary case. This would have gone nowhere near the courtroom. It's this erroneous chain linking. It's mentioned in the case of Lucia de Burgh. This was a critical aspect of why Lucia de Burgh suffered a miscarriage of justice, was this chain linking of cases. It fundamentally leads to unsafe convictions and to miscarriages of justice because it makes it seem that there's a lot of evidence against the defendant, when in reality, a lot of these cases are complete crap. We know for a fact that what Derry Evans has said is total rubbish. And the idea and the fact that he was allowed to sit in court and go over child A, then B, C, D, and so on, all the way through these things, and then link them together, and then have the prosecution say, oh, look, it could only possibly be Lucy Letby because of this shift chart. The whole point is that has no merit, and that is evidentially unsound. The most recent addition. So then in this statement, she says, these are linked. And I think that was one of the arguments they made as well as a practical one, which I accept would have been a problem, but not insurmountable, you might think. So I'm not sure that makes a great deal of sense. But the whole point is that this linking of them together makes it an unsafe conviction. It's fundamentally problematic. And the standard of evidence for the individual cases, as we know, was very poor. So saying they're not separate, they're linked. Yes, they're linked by the shift chart. Probably another theme I should have mentioned is that Caroline and Liz managed to studiously avoid mentioning all of the enormous problems with the prosecution case. Somehow they managed to do this in every single episode of their podcast. And this is another example of it in this episode. So then Dr. Michael says that's true, and of course they were linked for circumstantial evidence, weren't they? But it was clear that at that stage, had the case been heard one by one, Mr. Myers was saying, I would be called as a witness. So essentially, if the trial had been fair, this guy would have been called as a witness. But because the judge decided, let's make the trial as unfair as possible, he wasn't called as a witness. So that's great, really. So that, if anything, that just makes it worse. That doesn't make it better for the court or the legal system or the outcome. That makes it worse. So anyway, he says, so somewhere along the line that decision seems to have changed. Then Cheetham says, but your argument, I suppose, this is a thing Caroline and Liz do. They always feel the need that they need to impose their bizarre kind of, I would say, stilted commentary over things where they just start commenting like Mr. Hull, Dr. Hull, Professor Hull doesn't need you to interpret what he's saying. He's perfectly capable of expressing himself. You know, he doesn't need you to tell him what his argument is. But anyway, she does feel the need to do that. But your argument, I suppose, and your concern is that even though he lost that legal argument to have the case heard in the way he wanted it to be heard, you still felt that he should have called you despite him losing that legal argument to have them heard effectively separately. So basically, we're just going to completely ignore what he's just said and then just pretend that this is somehow significant. And then Michael says, well, I'm not a lawyer and I don't play the game of law. You know, the job of the lawyers is, Mr. Myers' case is to defend his client to get the best outcome for his client as he can. Unfortunately, that's the way the law works. And I think that's a shame. Well, more than a shame. I'm not in any way saying that not calling me was wrong as such from a legal game point of view. However, in terms of natural justice, it seems appalling, I think, that Lucy Letby did not have the opportunity of having her case presented. And for some of the evidence which had been presented, particularly the medical evidence, I think to have been queried, and as I'm sure you're both more aware, but maybe your audience isn't. But although Mr. Myers did his best, I think, to give rebuttal to some of that evidence, that doesn't count. It has to be another expert witness who says, no, what they said was wrong. It doesn't count if it's the lawyer that says that. So in terms of natural justice, I think that's not fair. So essentially, for anyone who's got the sense they were born with, anyone who didn't fall to earth in the last shower of rain, what he said there is just irrefutably true. It's obvious that everything that has occurred in this court case runs completely contrary to what he describes as natural justice. I would say it runs contrary to anything that you could describe as an acceptable process. But because Liz and Caroline are desperate to buttress the guilty case because they've completely committed themselves to that since day one, and they've got their podcast series to defend and their careers to defend and their egos to defend, they obviously are completely in love with the system, and so they can never accept any criticism of the system, and certainly they themselves don't make any criticism of the system. So then we have Liz Hull saying, so I mean, what are the legal commentators or barristers that Caroline and I've spoken to in previous episodes have said is that Mr. Myers obviously took a legal tactical decision. So they're obsessed with this. They're obsessed with barristers. They're obsessed with the court. They're obsessed with judges. They're obsessed with the procedure. They're obsessed with tactics. Probably because it's the only thing they've got to cling to. And like you said, he did robustly challenge Dewi Evans, who I think gave evidence 16 times for all but one of the babies. But the point that you're making, of course, is that, no matter how well he challenged Dewi Evans, Steve Breary, Ravi Jairam, John Gibbs, so they do this thing of just listing people just to try and emphasise, well, look how many people there were for the prosecution. All the local doctors who were called to give evidence, and he put the flaws in the case, the medical problems that the babies were suffering to them, which the jury obviously heard. That's just waffle, Liz. But what you're saying is that ideally you could have obviously provided a better insight for the jury into that. So, I mean, that's just a waste of our time, because it doesn't even mean anything. But anyway, Dr. Michael, no, that's not quite what I'm saying. It's what the judge said to the jury was you have to ignore what Mr. Myers said because it doesn't count. That was pretty straightforward to me, Liz. I understood that. I'm pretty sure everyone listening will have understood that. It's kind of quite surprising that this supposedly high-ranking journalist didn't understand it. It has to be a witness that says that, Liz. So Dr. Evans and Dr. Bohin made some statements which were incorrect, certainly in my opinion incorrect, and it is my position, I think, that someone, me or someone else, should have got into the witness box and said, actually, what they said, that's not quite the way it was, or that's not quite what they meant. Whatever piece of clinical events were occurring. So you can see here, in the statements that have just been made there, for example, you can see how Professor Mike Hall is much more circumspect, as indeed he should be, arguably, about speaking about Dr. Evans, about speaking about the evidence in court. So we're going to see in the Channel 4 documentary, that's coming out that I'm going to be reviewing on the 30th of September, Dr. Evans making his usual procession of absolutely ridiculous extreme comments. And he has no qualms about doing that, and he will just come out fighting and say, everyone is wrong and everyone is an idiot apart from me. And I don't think Professor Michael would ever do that. I think that's quite clear. I think he will make much more moderate professional statements, essentially. And that is another massive problem with the court system, is that if you've got people who are willing to go in there as expert witnesses, and they're willing to go in and say, I'm 100% correct, I'm certain, then you've got a massive problem. If you have more professional people on the other side who take their profession seriously, you might say, who are not willing to say that. So he uses the phrase here, that's not quite the way it was. Now, the doctors and professionals that I've spoken to don't put it quite that way. They're far stronger in their statements against Dr. Evans. But if you can't get someone who's willing to go in the witness box and say that, then that is a problem. Even if the court case was presented A, then B, then C, then D. The point is that what Dr. Evans has put in this court case is farcical. It's an absolute joke, and the way he arrived at that is also an absolute joke. Whether that's going to be revealed fully on the public stage, I sincerely hope that it is. But whether Professor Michael was quite the right person to counter this absolute nonsense, I don't know. So then Caroline Cheetham says, can you give us an example then of one of those moments when you're sitting in Court 8, and in fact I was sitting in Court 8 for quite a lot of this trial as well. Were you, Caroline? I didn't realise you were in court. I've not heard you mention that before. You really should bring that up more often in your podcast. So I remember you being in there every single day where you were sort of inwardly jumping up and down thinking, I need to challenge this point and I'm hoping I'm going to get the opportunity to, but I can't. You know, we talked about Dewi Evans and, of course, Sandy Bowen, who peer-reviewed all of his findings. And then, of course, you've got Professor... So, I mean, basically, just every so often, they just try to list as many people as they can in a vain attempt to make the prosecution case seem legitimate. And then, of course, you've got Professor Monarides, Owen Arthur, Professor Hindmarsh, a number of outstanding experts from across the country. Where were the moments where you felt we need to challenge this particular piece of evidence that's being given now to the jury because it's not fair? He didn't say it wasn't fair, he said it was wrong. There's two different things. And then Dr. Mike Hall says, well, shall I give you two examples? So if we take baby A, and to be fair, Mr. Myers did his very best to get this point across, he put up on the screen the intensive care chart for baby A, which showed the baby's respiratory rate and the heart rate actually in the temperature. I don't know if you remember that. Now that showed very clearly that baby A had a respiratory rate of above 70 for at least 12 hours. Actually it was almost 24, just about 24 hours before he collapsed, the respiratory rate. And actually I did some analysis of the data. And if you draw a trend line through the respiratory rate, it shows that it was actually increasing. Overall, the trend was that it was increasing. Now, a respiratory rate of, say, 75 in a premature baby is extremely worrying. And actually, you wouldn't be too surprised if you didn't do anything about that if the baby collapsed, or at least had what's called apnea, or a pause in breathing. Now, I think Mr. Myers did his best to try and point that out, but if I had, or someone like me, got into the witness box, I think we would have been much more emphatic to say, no, that really is abnormal. That respiratory rate really is abnormal. And Dr. Evans and Dr. Bohin said, oh no, it doesn't matter because the blood gases were normal and the baby didn't need oxygen. The point of having an increased respiratory rate is to reduce your need for extra interventions like oxygen. So the baby, in my view, was defending itself against the need for other intervention until he could no longer be there. So the point obviously being made here by Professor Hall is that child A was not as well as presented by Dr. Evans and Dr. Bohin, particularly Dr. Evans, of course. And this is something that they have contested, but certainly every neonatologist that's looked at the case and every expert that I've spoken to and every medic and every scientist all agrees that these infants were in a much worse condition than was conveyed in the court. That's absolutely critical because it's a central contention of the prosecution that, oh, this baby was doing well, it was absolutely fine, it was just about ready to come out of hospital, then it collapsed for no reason. There is no way the jury can defend themselves against those accusations. They can't possibly see through those accusations. I wouldn't be able to if I was in court. Obviously I would now, I'd have a better chance of doing it now. But 2 years ago, if I, by some twist of fate, if I'd been in the jury, there's no way for me to say, well, Dr. Evans is wrong. I mean, the respiratory rate is really concerning. I haven't got a clue. And this is why it's ridiculous for whichever one of Hull and Cheetham it was to say that the barristers are now neonatal experts. The barristers haven't got a clue about neonatology. Neither have I. I just learn what I can from speaking to people that do. And I try to take it on board and I try to understand what is possible for me to understand. But there is no prospect on this earth that the jury can see that they've given a very misleading picture of child A. And we know a lot more about child A, and I'll be going to be going over the background of child A and child B in a future video. So then Cheetham says, I think one of the big points you make about baby A, if I can stick with this for a minute, is that he wasn't as well as Dr. Evans and Dr. Bowen said he was. He literally just said that, Caroline. He literally just said that. They said he was doing well. That was one of the praises that was used, I think, doing well. And then Michael says, well, more than that. It was more emphatic than that, actually. It was really, really well. Then Cheetham says, so one of your points is that he really wasn't very well, and there were signs from these charts that he wasn't doing very well. It's not one of his points, right? He's a professor of neonatology, whereas you know literally nothing other than the notes that you've made. So I mean, it's not a point. He's telling you that is the case. You can't quibble on this. You can't question this. You don't know you wouldn't even know one side of a stethoscope from another, or a scalpel, or any form of medical equipment, just like I wouldn't. What's your fear then of did that cause the collapse and then the death, or was that just a sign that things were going wrong in your view? So it's a classic nonsense question. So let's break this down. What's your fear then of did that cause the collapse? What does that mean? And then the death, or was that just a sign that things were going wrong in your view? That doesn't even mean anything. That doesn't even mean anything, Caroline. It's just nonsense. So what she's trying to say, I think, is that somehow baby A could have been deteriorating and in a bad state, and in a state in which the infant could have collapsed. As Professor Hull just said, Professor Hull just literally said it wouldn't be surprising if this infant collapsed under the circumstances. So what she's trying to suggest is that the infant can be deteriorating, the infant can be in a bad physical state, the infant can be in a scenario in which it's not surprising if the infant collapses, but we can then park that to one side and say that the infant can collapse anyway, and it's nothing to do with the circumstances we've just described. So that's the kind of idiocy you get from these people that are medically illiterate. Now, I've at least, over the last 2 years, because I've done a lot of research and I've spoken to a lot of people, I've interviewed over 60 people, and I've actually tried to learn from them, unlike these two. These two just interview people and then try to impose their view on them, which is kind of ridiculous because they don't know anything. But what I've tried to do over the last 2 years, hopefully this is evident from the interviews that I've done, is that I've tried to learn from people who know more than me. And typically if you do that, you'll become more informed. If you decide, I've decided this person is guilty, so whatever happens and whatever person comes in here, I will just try to challenge what they've said, and I'll try to brush it to one side and sweep it under the carpet and then pretend that I'm still right at the end of it. If you do that, then you'll end up talking complete crap, which is what Caroline has just done in this question. So Dr. Mike Hull says the following. Well, it was a sign that I think if you were a neonatologist looking after that baby, that you would be saying to yourself, should we be doing something about this? Why has this baby got this fast breathing rate? And you may come from inclusion. Well, we'll just wait and see, but as a neonatologist, you would know that could be unwise. So then Liz Hull says, this should be good. So you might not be very happy with me saying this, but I've actually seen your report on baby A, which I've said before. So know what I'm saying. So they've got this guy in the studio. They're not taking on board what he's saying. They're not learning from what he's saying. They're just trying to put new arguments at him to say, oh, actually Lucy's guilty because we've decided that she's guilty in our podcast series. You know, and did I mention I was in court every day? And you may say, and people that are defenders of Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham, I can't imagine there are many in number, and I would imagine the average IQ is quite low, but there will be some people out there who wish to defend them still. So what they will probably say is, oh, you know, they challenge all of their guests. But do they really? Do they really challenge the guests who come on and say that Lucy Letby is guilty? If they have a police officer on here, do they really challenge the police officer and say, was your investigation actually completely inept? Do they really do that kind of thing? No, they don't, from my experience. So she says here, I think the problem with that is that, oh, so you think there's a problem. You think there's a problem, Liz, right? With your, what medical qualifications have you got exactly? I think it's fair to say, correct me if I'm wrong in your report, you say that the reason for his death, you cannot rule out accidental or deliberate injection of air by a member of staff. So then Dr. Michael, or Professor Michael, really, I think it should be, says, I think that's the way it is being read, and obviously if that's the way it's being read, then I should have been more careful about the way that I wrote it. But actually, I can tell you, I can't tell you, I don't think, what the defence lawyers asked me to do when I was writing my report. But of course, part of the job of a defence expert witness is to look at what the prosecution has said and to pose the question. They're saying it could be an injection of air. Well, of course it could be. Any baby could have died by injection of air. Injection of air could kill a baby, but I at no time said that that is what happened. So I'm going to discuss this in more depth. I'll just continue with what Cheetham is saying. No, but you do say that you couldn't rule it out. And of course, the prosecution will then go, so Ben Myers makes this decision. He knows this is baby A. This is the first baby in the case. And he knows that Nick Johnson is going to just keep on saying to you, but your report clearly says, Dr. Hull, you can't rule it out. That certainly would indicate a reason that Ben Myers felt that he couldn't possibly then call you for the others as well, because he can't get beyond baby A. It's too much of a risk, essentially. So I'll just give a little bit of commentary here. This is, again, just people that are in thrall with the court system. What actually matters here is that it's phenomenally unlikely that any of these babies has had air injected into the system. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is there is no evidence to support that, because the evidence that was used is completely erroneous. So therefore, the fact that Mike Hall won't get on the stand and say, I can 100% say categorically that this wasn't an air embolism, is kind of irrelevant, because you're supposed to prove beyond reasonable doubt. That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, what matters, again, I don't know how many times I'll need to emphasise this, but what matters is what happened in actual reality. So what matters is the fact that on the neonatal unit, there were no injections of air into these infants. And that's very clear, because now you have Professor Lee, who authored the paper on which the diagnosis was primarily based, although Dewi Evans said that he diagnosed this before he even encountered that paper, before he encountered the rashes and discoloration. So he basically diagnosed it on nothing at all, which makes it even more ridiculous. But anyway, you now have Professor Lee. Obviously, firstly, he's way, way, way more qualified than Dr. Evans, and secondly, he's authored the only diagnostic paper that he has used to diagnose embolism, and he's saying, well, you're fundamentally wrong in everything that you've done. So the fact that someone could have got in the witness box and Nick Johnson might have said something to him, and Dr. Evans would have stood there going, oh, well, I'm 100% certain, and Professor Michael would have said, well, I can't be 100% certain, but there's simply no evidence to support it. And then the court would have come to the decision, oh, well, Dr. Evans said he's 100% certain, so therefore we'll say that Lucy Letby is guilty. What you still have there is a flawed legal process. That doesn't affect in any way what happened in actual reality whatsoever. And that's the important thing. The important thing is that clearly there's a massive doubt at best about what Dr. Evans has put in this court case. This is the primary contention of the prosecution, that there was air embolism and injection of air in these cases. And actually, there's no evidential support for that. So I do need to explain that at this point, but we're going to discuss this in quite a bit more depth, because Liz and Caroline are going to make some further extraordinary statements. So then, in response to what Caroline Cheetham has just said, Professor Mike Hall says the following: that may well be the case, but I don't think that anybody could honestly say that you could rule it out. Of course you can't rule it out. It is a possibility, but it's not a probability. And I at no time said that I thought that it is likely that this had happened. And then, so here's Liz Hull again. Yeah, and that's in a way, that's the legal game. Should this be a game? Should this be a game in the courtroom? Why are we so obsessed with the legal process? Why are we so obsessed with legal procedure? You've just had a neonatologist. Dewi Evans is not even a neonatologist. We've been over this many times. He never qualified as a neonatologist. He hasn't worked in a hospital for 20 years. The only time he's been in a hospital over the last 16, 17 years is if his varicose veins are playing up. That's it. He has no qualifications. And he said, by his own admission, that he has no experience in air embolism. He never dealt with it, doesn't know anything about it, and he was relying entirely on one academic paper. The author of that academic paper has now said, essentially, as politely as possible, he's talking complete crap. That's the important thing. It doesn't matter about the legal game. That's why people think it's a miscarriage of justice, because of the legal game. Because what is an inadequate, unfair court process has produced this extremely unsafe conviction that, as I keep mentioning, is not reflective of what happened in actual reality, which is what matters. It doesn't matter who called what person and why, and the strategy involved, and the way that the legal system works, and whether the judge said this or whether the judge said that. What matters is that these infants were not injected with air, and that there were no crimes on this unit, and there were no murders, and that what Dr. Evans said in court is a steaming pile of dog shit, frankly. So then Liz Hull goes on to say, and it was... Oh, so she says here, and that's a problem with the system and the expert witness system, I suppose you could say, because that's Nick Johnson's job to undermine your reports. I mean, that's essentially meaningless. I don't know what she means by that. And it was Ben Myers' job to undermine what Dewi Evans was saying. It doesn't matter about undermining things or undermining things again. It doesn't matter about the legal process. What matters is medically what happened on the unit. That is what matters. I don't know how many times I have to emphasise that. It's not about the court system. It's not about barristers. It's not about judges. It's not about legal arguments. It's not about jurisprudence. It's about the medical outcomes of the infants. So then she goes on to say, and I'd be interested to think what you think about this narrative that's emerged after the trial that Ben Myers didn't do a very good job. From where I was sitting, he was, a bit like a Rottweiler, really, when he did not give Dewi Evans an easy time. So I will firstly say in response to that I've said several times that Ben Myers did a good job in cross-examination. Where he has made mistakes, in my view, are some of the decisions that he has made. I think he could have put much stronger evidence in the court himself. I think he could have got experts because Nina Modi wanted to appear. He was very unfortunate. Obviously, we now know that he would have called some experts. He's obviously hamstrung by the court system to some extent, and he's hamstrung by how hard it is to get defence witnesses and various other things. It's also obviously a very difficult case for him because it's medical matters and he doesn't really understand them, even though Caroline and Liz think you can become an expert on neonatology by being in a court case for a couple of years. So he did have a lot of problems, undoubtedly, but it's not really important, again, whether or not he did a good job. I don't think he did a 10 out of 10 job, or even a 9 out of 10 job, or even a 7 or 8 out of 10 job. If I was being generous, I'd say he did a 6 out of 10 job, and that is being generous. So you would ideally want, considering he's supposed to be a top barrister, Lucy Letby obviously needs a very strong defence because she's facing 14 life sentences. Well, potentially in this trial she's facing, 17 or 17, isn't it, life sentences? Or was it more because there were more than 17 attacks? She was facing a lot of life sentences anyway. You want your barrister, obviously, to be of the highest calibre. You don't want a 6 out of 10 barrister up against Johnson. Most people said he gave an 8 or 9 out of 10 performance. So you obviously don't want that. I don't think he did do a very good job. However, that's not really important. What is important is that jury was completely misled by the prosecution evidence and never got to hear an absolute ton of really important evidence that was in Lucy's favour. That's what's important. Again, the jury didn't get to hear about what happened in actual reality. That's the problem. It's not whether or not Ben Myers was good in court. That's nothing. That's really a side issue. Anyway, she goes on to say, from where I was sitting, he was, a bit like a Rottweiler. He did not give Dewi Evans an easy time. I mean, you will have watched that. He didn't give him an easy time. He didn't give, Sandy Bohin an easy time. None of the doctors, I would say, at the Countess he gave an easy time to. He was, robust is a word that's been used to describe his cross-examination, but it was very intense cross-examination for those doctors. So I just wonder what you think about that. Well, I don't know why you're asking Professor Michael. I don't know why you get asking. You've got an expert on neonatology, who's a professor on neonatology, and you're asking about what did you think of the defence barrister. Who cares? He's not a legal expert. He doesn't really even care, apart from he thinks that the legal system is inadequate, which I agree with. I don't care what Ben Myers' performance was like in court. I don't care what Nick Johnson's performance was like in court. I care about the infants, and I care about whether they died the way that we were told in court, which we know that they did not. So, I mean, this is kind of a really asinine line of questioning. When you've got I interviewed a neonatologist quite recently. Many of you will have watched this. I interviewed Professor Colin Morley. Did I ask him about the defence barristers? Or did I ask him about the court process? Or did I ask him even about statistics, for example? No. Surprisingly, I asked him questions solely about neonatology and then a couple of general questions about the case. What did you think about Nick Johnson? What did you think about when he said this? What do you think about the pyjamas? What do you think about the shredders? Of course I didn't say that to him because it would have been bloody ridiculous. Anyway, now Professor Hull says, well, I think you're right. He did his very best, I think. This is just a personal observation now. Dr. Evans, I don't think he'd particularly mind me saying that he's a real Welsh bruiser. No, I don't either. No one asked your opinion, Liz, really. Professor Hull says, he's been to court probably 100 or 200 times, I think he says, He's well able to handle counsel. He knew what he was doing. He knew, I think, how to rile counsel, and that became a bit of an issue, I think, at times. And then Cheetham says, You mentioned in your previous answer about the fact that you said you couldn't rule out that baby A was injected deliberately with air in your report, which might well be why then Ben Myers made the decisions that he then made. And you said nobody could rule that out. So I wonder what you now make of the expert panel's vociferous absolute ruling out that any baby was injected with air. If you can't rule that out from studying all these records for months and months, how can they? So I want to pause at this point and reflect on this statement made here by Cheetham. So she said, I wonder what you now make of the expert panel's vociferous absolute ruling out that any baby was injected with air. So I'll just have a look at, actually we should look first to get the full picture of what he said here before we go into further analysis of this. So Mike Hall says, there was no evidence of any of the babies being injected there, but unfortunately it is possible for babies to be injected with air without there being evidence. So if any doctor is being honest, I think they would have to all say, no, we can't rule that out, but we really don't think there's any evidence of it or that it's at all likely. So then Liz Hall said, so you don't think that any of the babies that displayed the rash that the prosecution said was indicative but not diagnostic of air embolism, or the bubbles of air found in the blood vessels by Owen Arthurs and in the brain and the heart of the babies by Dr. Manrides, Professor Manrides, you don't say that's evidence of air embolism, you don't think they're correct. Then Professor Michael says, I don't think it is evidence for air embolism actually, at least not the gas in the abdominal vessels. It could be, but there's other reasons why gas can be in the blood vessels after death. And then Liz Hall says, my understanding is that the defence did commission a radiologist to counter Owen Arthur's reports, and the report was disclosed, but she wasn't called either for whatever reason. So I can tell you the reason for that, Liz, is because Owen Arthurs didn't offer any support to the prosecution, and he just said, there is air. Then he did the study, for the Great Ormond Street Hospital study, in which he found that air is often present in many infants. So the reason they didn't commission a radiologist, the reason they didn't call a radiologist, was that all a radiologist could have said in court was, there is air present, I can't say that this is anything to do with air embolism, which is exactly what Owen Arthurs said. So then Professor Michael says, the reason she wasn't called was that the two of them met, as did we, as did the other expert witnesses, to try and decide what they agreed on. And what happened at the meeting of the radiologists was that they said there were no significant areas of disagreement. Therefore, there was no point in calling both of them, which is literally exactly what I've just said. The problem with that is, did Professor Arthurs really put the argument across in the same way as the other radiologists might have done? So I'm just going to pause at this point, and we're just going to look at this statement that's made here by Caroline Cheetham. So she says, I wonder what you now make of the expert panel's vociferous absolute ruling out that any baby was injected with air. So we're going to look at what the expert panel actually said. The most recent... So remember that Caroline Cheetham has said that they vociferously completely ruled out air embolism. And Professor Michael said there is simply no evidence of air embolism. So let's see what the panel actually said about the infants in this case. So for child A, they said there was no evidence of air embolism. For child B, they said there was no evidence to support air embolism. For child C, there is a very obvious bowel obstruction in this case. So they reference here in the conviction that it was alleged that air had been deliberately injected into child C through the nasogastric tube sufficient to cause his collapse. Then they mention here the suggestion that the multiple signs of intestinal obstruction could be caused by injection of air through the nasogastric tube is untenable. I think everyone that has any understanding of neonatology agrees with that. I mean, so many paediatricians and neonatologists have looked at this case by now, and this is a case of a really obvious bowel obstruction. It's clearly nothing to do with air. So they obviously mention that. And then they go on to say the clear prior signs of intermittent bowel obstruction that warranted urgent surgical opinion and investigation had gone unrecognised. So then in the case of child D, they say there was no evidence of air embolism. In the case of child E, they say there was no evidence of air embolism. They don't comment on air in child F because child F is one of the insulin cases. In the case of child G, they say there is no evidence to support air injection into the stomach or overfeeding. In the case of child H, they give a bit more detail here because, again, there's a very straightforward explanation for this infant. This is a straightforward case of a relatively large preterm infant with respiratory distress syndrome who developed a tension pneumothorax. In the case, I forget exactly what the prosecution allegations were for child H, but it's largely irrelevant. In the case of child I, they say there is no evidence of air causing splinting the diaphragm or of air embolism. In the case of child J, they say there is no evidence to support malicious airway obstruction. I didn't look at case at child K because that's the ridiculous JRAM virtually red-handed case. Child L is an insulin case. I apologise, the image is really poor for this, but it goes over a page and it would have taken ages to reorganise it, so I just thought I'd do it like this. But for child M, they say there was no evidence of air embolism. In the case of child N, they say crying was not due to injury or air embolism. In the case of child O, they talk about, this is absolutely ridiculous because air has clearly nothing to do with this infant whatsoever. So in the case of child O, the panel says it was initially alleged that child O received inflicted blunt trauma to the abdomen, causing purpuric discoloration and rupture subcapsular hematoma of the liver, and that air was injected into the nasogastric tube to cause gaseous distension of the intestines. Later, the accusation was changed to deliberate injection of air into his circulation. So, I mean, this is just an absolute joke to suggest that air has anything to do with this case. And they say the suggestion of injection of air into the circulation is conjecture, which is, again, a generous description to describe it as conjecture. And then for child P, they say there was no evidence of air injection into the stomach or into the intravenous line. And then in the case of child Q, they say there was no evidence to support air injection into the stomach through the nasogastric tube. So let's go back and look at what Caroline Cheetham said. She said, "I wonder what you now make of the expert panel's vociferous absolute ruling out that any baby was injected with air." And then Michael said there was no evidence of any of the babies being injected there. And then we see that what the panel actually said is that there's no supporting evidence. So there should be clearly supporting evidence for air embolism if you're going to make this very unlikely diagnosis. That's really the whole point. So there are four possibilities at this point. Either Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham have not read the preview report from the expert panel. The second possibility is that Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham are abjectly stupid and cannot understand the preview report from the expert panel. The third possibility is that Liz Hull and Caroline Cheetham are deliberately misrepresenting what was said in the preview report from the expert panel and are essentially lying. And the fourth possibility is a combination of 2 and 3. Now, I'll obviously leave viewers to make up their own mind about which one of these applies, but this is an instance where I'm happy to give my opinion, and my opinion is 3. I think they're quite clearly deliberately lying here. I can't believe that they haven't read the preview report, and it's basically impossible to misunderstand the preview report because it's stated explicitly in every single case very clearly, and their position is very consistent with Professor Michael Hall. So they are obviously deliberately misrepresenting what was said in the report, in my opinion. But obviously you can make your own mind up about that. The most recent... So I'll conclude this video here. I was hoping to get halfway through the podcast, but that's about 1/3 of the way through, so I'll make further episodes in the future. I've got the themes on the screen here, and the 6th theme, appealing to emotion, occurs more later in this video. The first 5, blind faith in the system, putting the court and jury on a pedestal, being particularly obsessed with legal tactics, arguments of procedure and jurisprudence, deliberately misrepresenting something that's been said, and claiming that there were experts in court, so it's just one group of experts against another group of experts. I would say that they were all very evident throughout what we've been through so far, and I'm sure people will agree. I just want to finish this by saying I think it's highly regrettable, and it's generous to describe this as regrettable, that because Caroline Cheetham and Liz Hull have done a podcast, and because they were in court, and because they've decided that Lucy Letby was guilty, and because they've been taken in by the prosecution case, they now have to cling to that desperately and make these arcane arguments while ignoring the absolute cavalcade of arguments against guilt, which they systematically did in this interview, and as far as I'm aware, they systematically do that in every episode of the podcast. I don't know if that's due to vested interest. I don't know if it's due to ego. I don't know if it's due to some instruction of what their role is at the Daily Mail. It's impossible for me to say. It could, of course, be a combination of those things. But I think it's highly regrettable that two people that consider themselves to be journalists can so completely and utterly lack any objectivity when talking about what is such an important topic with such huge consequences, not just for Lucy Letby, but for the safety of the healthcare system, and indeed whether or not the criminal justice system can actually deal with cases of this nature. Because they wouldn't have a clue, indeed they didn't have a clue, and it was certainly never reflected in any of their podcasts that I've heard, that the science that was presented in court is really, really poor. Now, I met a friend over the last year, and at some point I mentioned to him what I'm doing currently, and he'd actually heard a bit of the Daily Mail podcast. He described it, his words not mine, as trash. But of course, he came away from that with the impression that they were guilty. There was no balance in that podcast whatsoever. And that remains the case today, even though now there's just such compelling evidence that Lucy Letby is innocent. And yet Liz and Caroline continue to skate around that in a quite embarrassing fashion, I would say. They're just doing figure of eights around the truth on their skating rink. We now know undeniably that the science that was presented in court is really, really poor. So you would think that their so-called award-winning podcast would actually represent that, but of course it doesn't. Some of the arguments they presented here may appear superficially convincing, but if you actually break them down as I've done in this video, they're not. It's just all the same thing about procedure, the court, jury, barristers. That's all they go on and on about. Because they can't talk about the science, because that requires an incredible act of skating around the truth. And I think it's hugely disappointing that they're so determined to claim that Lucy Letby is guilty, even though this requires acts of logical and intellectual contortion in order to maintain this position. As for the determination to put the system on a pedestal that they both display, I just simply cannot understand that. I don't understand how you can have such blind faith in anything. I suppose we're all different, but the level of system-serving, unquestioning, obsequious behaviour that they demonstrate is simply incomprehensible to me.